If you say these sorts of things that I said here, you are not sure anymore that you will have your job in the United States on the next day.
There's more and more classical liberals calling themselves libertarians.
Part of the reason is, of course, that people don't read much. They are lazy. If you read, for instance, Hayek's most famous book, there is such an extensive list of things that the state should do that Swedish Democrat would easily be able to agree with all of it. I have come to the conclusion in the meantime, unless you have been frequently attacked to be a sexist, a homophobe, a racist, then you should ask yourself if there is something wrong with you. They said, we only have one child. We don't want another child because a second child will be an additional problem for world climate and so forth. You can reduce the problem by one if you just simply kill yourself on the spot.
Thank you, Hans, for coming to my show. And I guess the first question is, how did libertarianism came about, and how is it different from classical liberalism?
Maybe I should just say a few words about myself and how I became a libertarian myself. When I was young, I was a lefty. I grew up in the late 1960s, and when I started my studies in 1968, that was the high time of the student rebellion in Europe. My principal teacher at that time in philosophy, that was my first field, was Jürgen Habermas, who is worldwide probably the most prominent left-wing philosopher. I realized quickly the loopholes in the leftist doctrine and was on the lookout for some alternatives, and followed the newspapers for alternatives. I first discovered Milton Friedman. I quickly discovered certain inconsistencies in his work. Then from Milton Friedman I encountered Friedrich Hayek, who was well known, especially in Germany, because he was Austrian and won the Nobel Prize in 1974. Again, I discovered many mistakes in Hayek very quickly, and then through footnotes that I found in Hayek, I discovered Ludwig von Mises, who was one of Hayek's teachers, and I thought that Mises was a far superior thinker over Hayek. And from Ludwig von Mises, I discovered very quickly his most famous American student, Murray Rothbard. I went then from Germany to the United States to work with Rothbard, and I spent the 10 last years of Rothbard's life in close cooperation with him. Murray Rothbard is the founder of the modern libertarian movement. There would be no libertarian movement without Murray Rothbard. And I was, for the last 10 years of his life, I was his right-hand man. So I knew him better, at least at the end of his life, than anybody else. So I did not know anything about the libertarian movement in the United States. When I was a theoretician. I have always been a theoretician. I have never been involved in libertarian party activities. I was, of course, aware that there exists a libertarian party, and I went to 2 or 3 events that they organized, but that was just not my natural inclination. I was somebody who worked in his study and wrote and read. I thought it was somewhat of importance to show that I did not grow up in the United States. I was not involved in the libertarian movement from the very beginning. It was strange to me when I came there. I was happy to discover that there existed something like this, but I was never really heavily involved in it, even though in the course of my life, of course, I met almost all people who had some name, mostly through the connection that I had with Rothbard, who knew, of course, all the people. And in the course of the years, I met almost all leading figures myself, too.
So my question was, how did libertarianism came about? How is it different from classical liberalism, and why didn't just old ideas prevail? Why we deem Rothbard to be the author of modern libertarianism?
A major reason for that was that the term liberal in the United States had assumed a completely different meaning that it had in Europe. In Europe, liberals were people who were in favor of free market economy and a very limited state. Some of the more radicals were in favor of what is called a night watchman state, where the state doesn't do anything else but make sure that the police does its work and the courts do its work, and that's the end of their engagement. In the United States, however, liberal has the meaning of a social democrat. The Democratic Party in the United States are referred to as liberals, but they have nothing to do with classical liberalism as it existed in Europe. And because of that, I think there was a need to look for a new term. And in the course of looking for a new term, then also a radicalization of classical liberalism occurred. Not with all people who afterwards called themselves libertarian, but with people like Murray Rothbard in particular. Murray Rothbard was initially a Misesian in the sense that Mises wanted to have a minimal state, a state that doesn't do anything else except police force, external defense, and a judiciary. Rothbard then radicalized this by pointing out that even a minimal state does, of course, require taxation in order to be financed, and thought that that was a violation of basic moral principles, namely the principle that you should not aggress against other people and take the property of people who have justly acquired their property. So he made the step to what is called now anarcho-capitalism, which is a radicalized version of classical liberalism. His view was that even the function of judges, the function of defense, the function of police forces can be done better by competing organizations than by some monopolist that relies on taxation. People do want to be protected in their private property. Why don't they turn to private companies that offer services? I want to protect your private property. All you have to do is sign a contract with me. I offer this service. You don't have to sign up with me. You can also sign up with other people who defend yourself. So his view was there is nothing that private enterprises cannot do better than a monopolist provider such as the state. Now, the Rothbard program is still probably the most powerful program of libertarianism in the United States. However, there are also quite a few people who remained, in a way, classical liberals, but not calling themselves in the United States classical liberals, also adopting the term libertarians, but who refused to accept Rothbard's radical conclusion, everything has to be done by private enterprises. They thought, no, certain things have to be done by the state. Nowadays, classical liberals in Europe still have an affinity to the libertarians in the United States. And in the United States itself, you have, so to speak, two wings among among libertarians, those who are anarchists and those who cling to the classical, traditional European way of a minimal state.
So, if Rothbard used to be regarded as a founding father of modern libertarianism, why did departure from the Rothbardian tradition of libertarianism happen? Because today, when you talk to libertarians in the West, what you face is that there's more and more classical liberals calling themselves libertarians, and the Rothbardian tradition seems to be like taking the back step. Why did it happen?
Part of the reason is, of course, that people don't read much. They are lazy. And the more acceptable version is, of course, the classical liberal version. The idea that the state is necessary somehow is so ingrained in the heads of people that they could not free themselves of that preconception. And the other reason is indeed that the bigger this movement grew, the less was the number of people who actually read a lot of things. They were satisfied with just getting a few slogans, and that was enough. Whereas I think the major theoreticians of the libertarian movement, as far as I can tell, are all anarcho-capitalists, because the classical liberals do have a tremendous difficulty explaining how, if you have a minimal state that is a monopolist to decide how many resources do we need in order to do our minimal tasks of defending people, protecting their private property, there is no end to it. It's like, do we need $100 per person to just do this, or 150, or 200, or 300, or 1,000? There is no answer to this question. Whereas if you say, you don't need anything, then you have, of course, a very clear answer to this question. As a little anecdote, I can tell you that at the beginning, we probably come back to the split between various organizations in the United States. At the very beginning, the Mises Institute was also reluctant to come out openly in favor of anarchy, because Mises had made some remarks about feeling uncomfortable with that term. But Mises was, as a European, of course, influenced by the European types of anarchists who were mostly syndicalist anarchists, not private property anarchists, and rejected them. On the other hand, Mises, for instance, in his earlier works, pleaded for the right of every community to secede from its larger entity. So he said, even if a small village wants to secede from the country as a whole, they should be free to do that. And if an individual wants to secede from that small village, if that might not be very practical, but if it can be done, that also should be permitted. And by saying this, came, of course, extremely close to the idea that Rothbard promoted. And the two of them, as Rothbard was, of course, far younger than Mises, were always on good terms, and Mises wrote glowing reviews of Rothbard's main works.
You mentioned the split between libertarian institutions, and you mean the split between the Cato and the Mises Institute. What happened? Why did this split occur? Because I think few people realize, in Russia, definitely very few people realize that Rothbard actually founded both institutes, the Cato and the Mises Institute. And the reason why the Mises Institute was created is because there was some sort of conflict that made Rothbard leave the Cato. So what happened?
Yeah, it was initially, Rothbard was friends with the Koch brothers, especially I think Charles Koch. And the Koch brothers are the largest privately owned company in the United States. They are mostly in the oil business. Up to this day, they belong to the 10 wealthiest people in the United States. So Charles Koch was initially enamored by the ideas that Rothbard promoted. Then they had a fallout. Well, I put it this way, Koch was, so to speak, the money giver, and Murray Rothbard was the intellectual head of the outfit. When the Cato Institute was founded, Murray Rothbard became a share owner in the Cato Institute. But then the Cato Institute decided to move from the West Coast, where they were initially located in San Francisco, to Washington, D.C., and they wanted to become politically influential, and in order to gain political influence, they thought that it would be beneficial if, instead of, which was Rothbard's idea, promoting mostly Mises, that they would promote instead Friedrich Hayek, who is a far more moderate thinker. If you read, for instance, The Constitution of Liberty, which is one of Hayek's most famous books that was published in the 1960s, if you look at the third part of that book, where he discusses what would be the appropriate functions for states, there is such an extensive list of things that the state should do that a Swedish Democrat would easily be able to agree with all of it. Mises, of course, was what people called intransigent, but an extremist. He didn't make any compromises. He said, no, there should be no function of the state besides these few that I mentioned early on. So Mises was de-emphasized because he was considered to be politically impalatable, and Hayek was promoted. And that led then to a split. Rothbard refused to do that and said, if you have me as your head, I want to promote the Mises line, and I'm not in favor of the Hayek line. He even said, as a great danger, to choose Hayek as a promoter of libertarianism, free market stuff, because all the enemies of classical liberalism and libertarianism will point out to Hayek's book, Constitution of Liberty, and say, yeah, but you see, even this promoter of liberalism and libertarianism, he allows the state to do this, and he allows the state to do this, and he allows the state to do this. This is precisely what happened. And what then happened was, when Rothbard insisted that that should not be done, then they ousted him from the Cato Institute. They robbed him of his shares. He was silly enough, as he admitted afterwards, that he had his shares stored at the Koch headquarters in Wichita, Kansas, and the Koch brothers then told him, sue us if you want. And of course, Rothbard, he was a poor academic. So how are you going to sue multi-billionaires who can sue you back for 10, 20, 30 years? And he gave up. And then, after he was ousted from the Cato Institute then became a relatively moderate institution that tried to do lobbying work in Washington, D.C. Then Lew Rockwell, who had been a book editor and had published some of Mises's books, approached Rothbard and the widow of Ludwig von Mises with the idea I will found a Mises Institute that continues the work that originally the Cato Institute was supposed to do. When that happened, the Cato Institute and their financiers, again, you have to imagine that these guys had almost unlimited resources. They then started a campaign against the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute had to be destroyed. They wrote to all potential donors, don't give any money to that institute. These people must be eliminated. They must be destroyed. To no avail. I mean, it was difficult. I have been associated with the Mises Institute almost from the very beginning. It was founded in 1982. I moved to the United States in 1985. I worked with Rothbard first in New York City for a year, and then we both moved to Las Vegas. We were colleagues there, had our offices right next to each other. We had initially, Mises Institute had maybe a handful of employees, and Rothbard as his intellectual head, me as his assistant, and Walter Block somewhere in the background as well. That was it. In the meantime, of course, the Mises Institute is quite big. They rely on donations from small donors, but a large number of small donors, which makes you more independent. Because big donors tend to insist, no, this one topic, I don't want you to talk about this. This is what I want you to do. Small donors have no power over what the Institute does. I remember there were cases, for instance, when moderately sized donors, for instance, approached Lew Rockwell and said, Lew, get rid of this Hoppe guy. He is too radical. We don't want him. And we don't give you money anymore if you don't throw him out. And Lew Rockwell said, no way will I do this. Your contributions are certainly not big enough to make me a stupid decision like this. If you have a billionaire who says this sort of thing, and if he is not satisfied with your decision, then you are at the end. Then you have no funds whatsoever anymore. So the fact that the Mises Institute succeeded was due to the fact that large numbers of comparatively small donors sustained the Institute. And they have stayed true to the Rothbardian program. No other institution has done that. And I did play a role in persuading Lew Rockwell to give up this idea of we are in favor of limited government, and always refusing to say, no, we are anarcho-capitalist, by simply pointing out, Lew, is there any institution that says that they are in favor of unlimited government? And he said, of course, no, there's not a single institution that I'm in favor of unlimited government. So I say, so if you, even from a marketing point of view, you had to say, no, we are not in favor of unlimited, we are not in favor of limited government. Everybody is in favor of limited government. We are in favor of no government at all.
So it was the Koch brothers. They are still one of the major sponsors of all the libertarian organizations in the West. So would it be appropriate to say that big money corrupted the libertarian movement?
Yes, of course that would be true. And it was not, the Koch brothers did not only fund the Cato Institute, they funded Mercator's Center, large parts of George Mason University, the economics department, so is funded by the Koch brothers. And their policy up to this day is to make sure that there should be no mention of Rothbard, or if there is any mention of Rothbard, it should be in a negative way. I had friends, for instance, who were associated with the Cato Institute, and when they wrote articles where they cited me, they were immediately dismissed as adjuncts of the Cato Institute. There are journals, so-called Austrian journals. Some of my older students told me they had submitted articles to the journal, and the editor insisted, yeah, but any reference to the name of Hoppe you have to take out, otherwise we will not publish that article. They actually employed people with no other purpose than traveling around the world to all sorts of libertarian gatherings with the task of maligning, spreading evil rumors about Rothbard and me, to no avail. I never cared about it. I never replied to any of these things, and Rothbard and I became more and more successful despite all of these attacks that we had to endure to this very day.
And what do you think is their goal? I mean, why are they fighting for the limited government? Is it because if there is a government, big money can lobby their interest to it? Because you can't really lobby the market. You can only lobby the government.
I mean, imagine that you are a Mises Institute representative and ask yourself how many of these Washington higher ups would invite you and have conversations with you. And the answer is they are not interested to talk to us. We are not interested to talk to them because we know it will be all to no avail whatsoever. But if you want to be invited to the right cocktail parties and know prominent people, I have met Bush, I have met Obama, I have met whatever, some of these Fox News reporters and so forth, yeah, then you must be willing to make these compromises, and that's what the Cato Institute and all their representatives do. They are extremely proud about all the big shots that they know, whereas the big shots don't have much interest in meeting Mises Institute people.
There's a case of Ron Paul, for example, who is a pariah in the Cato Institute circles for pretty much the same reasons, because he always preached not just limited government, but a Rothbardian view of libertarianism. And he was quite successful in those kind of circles that you're talking about at the same time.
No, I mean, he was elected a few times to the House of Representatives from his local electorate, mm-hmm. But he was an outsider in Washington. He was well known as Dr. No, because every legislation that was proposed, he was the only one who said, no, I'm against this. Ron Paul was in the political establishment the person who was the most vigorous opponent of the Federal Reserve, of the American Central Bank, which made him an outcast. In addition, I should point out that Ron Paul was, of course, also a person who made remarks about, look, blacks commit more crimes than whites. There are certain dysfunctions that go on in some sectors of the American society, and was then immediately attacked as a racist. In America, in the meantime, everybody, whoever says not everybody is equal, there are people that are black and there are people who have slanted eyes, and then there are Caucasians, and then there are women and there are men. And men and women are not just the same. And blacks and whites differ in many respects. Anybody who opens his eyes and says these things that are obvious to every person who lives in the United States is considered to be a racist. I have come to the conclusion in the meantime, unless you have been frequently attacked to be a sexist, a homophobe, a racist or something like that, unless you have been frequently attacked as that, then you should ask yourself if there is something wrong with you. Because that is every normal person, according to this new doctrine of political correctness, every normal person is a racist, a homophobe, anti-women, and whatever it is. The only people who are responsible for every evil thing ever happened in the history of mankind are white heterosexual males. So keep in mind that you can afterwards go to all these guys here and tell them that everything bad that ever happened in your life to you is due to the fact that these evil white heterosexual people are oppressing you and have oppressed you for thousands and thousands of years. So anybody who has common sense is in the United States in the meantime attacked. If you say these sorts of things that I said here, you are not sure anymore that you will have your job in the United States on the next day. They will not jail you for this. In European countries, saying certain things, they even jail you. That they don't do in the United States. You can still say whatever you want, but if you still have your job on the next day, that is an entirely different question.
So how did the left manage to dominate the public discourse so efficiently for so long, to have the kind of influence that you just described?
I think that is the popularity of egalitarianism. For most people, it is difficult to admit that people are even though it is obvious, that people are very different, that there are some people are very good at doing certain things and other people are not so good, that there are successful men and women and losers, that there are some groups in the world that have accomplished more and other groups have accomplished less. Nobody likes to hear that you are not as good at such and such as this guy is. Why are the white heterosexual males attacked so much? Yeah, because if you look at in what places in world history were the greatest civilizational achievements achieved, and that is white heterosexual male societies are the ones that are the most successful by far. Compare that with Africa, compare that with the Middle East. So they cannot tolerate the fact that they have to admit that these people must have done something right and we must have done something wrong. Why are they so much more successful and why are we not as successful?
So aren't you tapping into the same kind of emotions that the leftists do when you talk about, how white heterosexual male, are being oppressed by the modern society? Aren't you talking to the losers of the current political situation and tapping into this sense of being a loser to help people organize maybe? But you're tapping into the same kind of emotion.
I appeal to the emotions of people that I think are essential in order to improve life and the living conditions of everyone. They are, after all, the promoters of civilizational progress. They should be hailed, and they should just be self-confident enough to say, look, what we have done is quite exceptional. We have done many wrong things maybe, but nonetheless, look where you would be without us. We are the ones that you should emulate. You should admire what we do instead of attacking us And if you admire us and recognize what role we played, you all will benefit in the long run from this, instead of attacking those people who are the guarantors of continuing prosperity for those people who think that they got the short stick in life.
But you're talking from the position of the moral superiority in that case.
I'm simply pointing out a fact. To whom do you owe your standard of living? To whom do you owe your great freedoms that you have? You should not cut down those people who played the most important role in assuring and guaranteeing what you currently have and are the best guarantors for your future progress. If you ask yourself the question, who created libertarian and liberal ideas? Who were the main writers that we look upon who realized how important private property is and the protection of private property is, especially also for the poorest people? Then you come to the realization those were very few people, mostly male, mostly in Western countries, and hardly anybody was a major liberal thinker, a major libertarian thinker, contributing anything to this movement, to this worldview, coming from other areas of the world. Not that they didn't have any, but almost none. So there should be an appreciation of those traditions that made the West great. I mean, Mises was right when he said the idea of freedom is a Western idea that has never existed to the same extent in any other part of the world except in Western societies. Western societies are not responsible for the plight of India and Africa and so forth. Quite to the contrary, if these countries have ever any chance to get out of their disastrous situation in which they are, then the only way to do it is to adopt Western ideas.
But if you listen to what the left has to say, they're actually questioning your entire presupposition. They question the validity of the argument that what we have today, the society that we have today, is something of value. That's their main point.
They can choose to live in other countries if they want. Why don't they move them to India or Africa if they are so unhappy with material wealth? I mean, it is easy to downgrade, this is only materialist, material wealth and all the rest of it. But if you are so concerned about that, then there are plenty of places in the world where you can go, but they don't go there. And you say, where are the people trying to move to? There's no mass migration movement from African country to India. There's no mass migration movement to Southeast Asia. The mass migration movement is to countries that are wealthier. And it should be recognized that they are wealthier for a reason.
They say we shouldn't have to move. We are the victims here. We are the victims of your oppression, and what you present as civilization is actually this story of oppression of whatever we value as a value.
Okay. Most of societies until about 1800s lived in the Malthusian age. That is, the growth of population outstripped the increase in productivity. That is, what Malthus described is no longer true, but it was true until about 1800. Again, to repeat, if the population increases, and of course before you had birth controls and things like that, the population dramatically increased sometimes. But you can feed an increasing population only if you have at the same time economic growth, if you have productivity advances that make it possible that additional people can also be fed. Until the 18th century, you had throughout the entire world massive amounts of people dying off because the economy did not allow everyone to survive. So the Western societies drew themselves out of this trap. It was not because they exploited any other society whatsoever, because there was nothing to exploit from these other societies. They were also poor. Since that time we have growing population plus increasing general standards of living on a worldwide scale. There have never been as many people freed out of extreme poverty as in the last 200 years. You can then only say they exploited their own workers. But the problem there is, of course, the workers could have become capitalists themselves. They decided not to become capitalists themselves because it required that they had to wait far longer before they would ever be paid wages. They decided, I want to become employed because as an employee I will become paid right away, whereas if I become a capitalist myself, I first have to build all the capital goods and have to wait until the capital goods are ready and turn out consumer goods, and only then do I collect any income.
But even the claim that we're feeding more people than ever, that we can feed the growing population, is under attack today. And if you look at Greta Thunberg, what she was saying in the United Nations just a couple of days ago.
How dare you!
I dare you! I double dare you, motherfucker!
She's attacking this exact idea that there's, there's too many of us, the situation cannot be sustained, and that you were selling, that's what they say, that we've been selling them a lie.
Okay, then, people who have that fear, I always tell, look, you can reduce the problem by one. If you just simply kill yourself on the spot, then the problem is already one person less. So, you have like Prince Harry and whatever, this Meghan girl. So they said, we only have one child. We don't want another child because a second child will be an additional problem for world climate and so forth. Then the question, why did you even have the first child? Why didn't you kill yourself on the spot? Then the problem is a little bit less. And the Greens and all of these people are not in favor of population control in Africa. Africa is the continent where you have enormous growth rates of population. Russia is a dying population. The number is declining. In Germany is declining. The only fact that it doesn't decline is because of the mass immigration that takes place, which all go on welfare in Germany. There is practically no European country that the native population even maintains the same size. The Western societies are by and large dying out, so we do what Greta Thunberg wants us to do, except that she doesn't kill herself. The countries that are the major danger are precisely those African countries with enormous, they have 5 kids, 10 kids, no problem. But this is not made into a problem. Quite to the contrary, we are the ones who are responsible for all of the evil things that go on in these places. Even though, according to their own doctrine, they are the main problem. That they just simply can't curtail their population growth.
So how did the right lose out on the public discourse? How did the right lose the popular support?
Yeah, that is a very, very interesting question. It has something to do with the transformation of the left, the traditional left. The traditional Marxist type left, they wanted to, means of production have to be socialized and so forth. And since that turned out to be a big disaster, After a while, people realized they wanted to create more prosperity than in the West, and of course, everybody could see that that was not the case. So then they had to change their doctrine, and they adopted this cultural Marxism and attacked traditional institutions like families, infiltrated all cultural institutions, and worked heavily with intellectuals. We have to realize that intellectuals are a very dangerous people. Intellectuals have difficulties making money. Who is interested in getting advice, listening to speeches, reading books? Most people have completely different interests. They watch TV, get drunk, try to look for girls and all that sort of stuff, or are tired when they come home from work. There's a very limited demand for intellectual services. I mean, writers and philosophers and economists and whatever it is. So these people, they were taken over by the state, turned into state dependents. And they realized that they have to promote these sorts of ideas in order to secure their own position. They formed alliances with the state.
So would it be accurate to say that the government force was used by the special interest group to secure their own privileged place in the society, to corrupt the actual society that they came from?
Yes, I would say that. Nowadays, at least in the Western societies, people spend almost 30 years of their life in government institutions. So first you go into kindergarten, that's a government institution, then you go to school. In the old days it was only 4 or 5 years, then it was 9 years, then it was 13 years. In the meantime, they also promote the idea that everybody has to go to the university, even though most of the people are not made for university studies, because most of the people are incapable of doing serious work at the university. And I tell you, I taught for 25 years at American universities. I mean, what low quality of students you get there is unbelievable. English is not my native language, but when I came to the United States and I asked Americans to write essays, I felt like I was Shakespeare as compared with what I saw there, and I stopped very quickly to give them essay questions and resorted then only to true-false questions. Because first of all, it was easier for me to grade, and I simply didn't want to do this to read this gibberish that these people were writing. So you have, might be 60 to 70% of an age group in the United States that goes to universities. That means they are not, the population in America did not get smarter. I mean, dumb people are now admitted to the universities. And then they invented new fields like Black studies, women's studies, Hispanic studies, gay, lesbian studies, and you get a degree in black, gay, lesbian, artistic studies or something like this, and have a degree. The longer people spend in educational institutions, the more they vote for left idiotic things. The most reasonable people are craftsmen, plumbers, electricians, people who know something that is needed in life and know how to put a nail into the wall. Somebody with a PhD in whatever, black lesbian studies, I'm sure they cannot even fry an egg in a pan, but they have a degree in whatever, gay, lesbian, black studies. This is a situation that becomes more and more prevalent in the Western world. The United States is sort of a leader in all of this, but you can see that also in Germany, you can see that in Austria, you can see that in France. Wherever you go, this is the same tendency. I already advocated that in order to avoid all of this problem, they should give a PhD to every born child. Immediately, once you are born, you get a doctorate. And that is, of course, the best recipe to make the population extremely smart from the very beginning. Unfortunately, my proposals are not always welcome, I must say.
You mentioned that there are some dumb studies and there are some proper studies, and the people who have common sense, they do something useful. But isn't that kind of arrogance actually brought the right wing to the situation they're in right now, because they didn't pay close enough attention to working with the public opinion. They didn't put enough value onto the kind of propaganda that left obviously understands, and precisely because of that, they ended up in the losing position.
Because they get the finances. The normal people are taxed to the hilt in order to finance people study idiotic fields at the university without any employment prospects. The only institution that employs these people afterwards is again the state. I mean, what normal company does need an expert in gay lesbian studies? But they even introduce that into normal business life by insisting that every company must now have a human resource department that sees to it that in every company there must be the right representation of all groups. There must be so and so many women, there must be so and so many minorities, there must be so and so many people who have certain disabilities. The only employment prospects these people have is either directly working for the state or working for companies that are obliged to follow state orders to have the right representation of different groups in different companies. Even though, for instance, take the example of women. So they have, say, in every major company there must be on the board of directors must be now whatever 30% of women, and the ultimate goal is we want to have 50% because 50% of the population are female, so there must be 50% of that. What they don't do is, of course, realize that there are many jobs where the same sort of demand are not made. If you look at the people who just clean the street or drive heavy equipment, who do heavy lifting, they are mostly male people working in these professions. But there they don't insist, oh, there must be just as many women who pour cement on the streets. There must be just as many women who take care of the garbage. There must be just as many women who serve in the military and so forth. They only pick out certain things. There must be just as many women as there are men, but not in other fields.
Is it correct to assume that the government cannot actually be used to help the society sort itself out? And the only reason why we have this kind of deviations is because the government forces it onto people. So when you're talking to the right, and there are libertarians and then there are traditional right wings. And when you talk to the traditional right wings, their argument is, we just have to take the power back. We have to take the government back. And then, now that it's the wrong people are at the power. If there were right people at the power, everything would be different. Is that a sound argument, given everything that you just said?
Of course, no, I oppose that just as much. I realize that the idea of many of the right-wing people is everything would be just great if we, instead of the left, run the show. They would run a different show, but it would have the same sort of excesses that the left has. Maybe it would be slightly more pleasant, but not by much. No, we have the power of the government has to be systematically reduced. All welfare has to be abolished. Welfare are institutions that break up the solidarity that normally exists within families. That you have, for instance, increasingly large number of illegitimate births. That you have increasing numbers of single mothers. Is a result of the fact that being a single mother, you get support. Normally, if you don't get any welfare support, you will be far more careful in who you marry, when you do get divorced, and so forth. If you know, however, if I get divorced, then I can rely on the government forcing my husband to pay for years and years and years, the likelihood that you will choose the wrong partner and easily divorce increases, for instance. For my heart, my personal life, I would think I am a conservative bourgeois person. But I resent the idea that these types of people become in charge of the state and then impose their particular view of the right way to live on everybody else. I think if welfare would be eliminated, more people would lead a responsible bourgeois life than they currently do.
So the government is the biggest threat to the traditional way of life?
Yes, I think by far, yeah.
Great.
You can always say, look, even if we have the freest libertarian society with all of these problems, it is possible that it can become a state again. And I remember what Rothbard said to these types of scenarios. He said, but then at least we had a glorious holiday. I would not deny, I mean, states have come into existence, and even if we succeed in abolishing them, it is possible that they come again into existence. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to reach that goal. We try to eliminate murder, that people murder each other. That is a constant desire, so to speak, of mankind. Why can't we get rid of murder? So would we say, because obviously murders occur and there are murderers running around, hey, we give it up. It makes no sense to do that, because they always spring up again. No, we never give up on it. Yeah, states have been around for quite some time. Sometimes they are worse and sometimes they're somewhat better. That doesn't mean that anybody has to say, since they have always been around and they can come again and whatever it is. So we simply give up on the goal. No, we don't give up on the goal.
So libertarianism is a permanent struggle for freedom.
Yes, it's the permanent struggle. And there will be permanent enemies of that thing. Envy is a big motive. Ruling over other people is a powerful motive. We have to be aware of that and have to combat it as good as we can. Sometimes we are more successful in it, and sometimes we are less successful in it. But there's no reason why you should ever give up a goal that is a moral goal. And a moral goal is, as far as I'm concerned, that we do not aggress against other people. If people do aggress against other people, then we should say so that was a moral failing or a crime, and we should blame these people and speak out and say this is not right. In private law, that's in the dealings that private citizens have with each other, the rules are more or less clear. Everybody knows that if I smash you in the face, that is not right, or if you smash me in the face, that is not right. Everybody knows that if you come and steal my wallet, that is stealing, unless you can show that I stole it from you yesterday. Everybody knows that if I burn your house down or you burn down my house, that is a crime, that is a punishable offense. What has been forgotten, that is the same standards we have to apply to politicians also. And when we apply that to politicians, and we realize, of course, yes, they are engaged in criminal activities on a massive scale. I don't want to talk about Russia or so, but look, what is George Bush? Yeah, George Bush is a killer. What is Obama? Obama is also a killer. They are responsible for killing innocent people. If you would do what these people did, you would be jailed. Why should different standards apply to them? The normal private law standards have to be universally applied. And then you come to the conclusion that even the best politicians, the most harmless politicians, so to speak, are at least robbers. The libertarianism, as far as I'm concerned, yes, all these economic questions are important too. Liberty creates more prosperity, helps the poorest people too. That's all good and fine. But the most important thing is to recognize, no, we are in favor of certain moral rules, and these moral rules apply to everyone, regardless of what his position is. It can be the highest ranking person or the most low-life person on earth, but nonetheless, a murderer is a murderer, and a robber is a robber, and a cheater is a cheater, and a fraud is a fraud.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so спасибо большое, что пришли. Моим зрителям на канале СВТВ, кто будет смотреть это в записи, я хочу сказать, что у нас сейчас продолжится общение с Hans-Hermann Hoppe. Мы пойдем в кафе, будем лично с ним общаться, поэтому становитесь патронами СВТВ, patreon.com СВТВ, для того, чтобы иметь доступ к таким эксклюзивным вещам. И там будут заданы вопросы, которые я не успел задать сейчас на передаче. Спасибо большое всем, кто пришел сегодня вживую послушать. Thank you, Hans, very much for the conversation, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.